Hi everyone, thanks again for joining us for the YNPN Book Club event with Paul Schmitz. We're discussing Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up. So I apologize for the technical difficulties that we had a few moments ago. We were just in the process of talking to Mac Antigua, the Director of Alumni Engagement with Public Allies. So Mac, you had just finished telling us a little bit about Public Allies, and so I'd actually like to turn it over to you now to introduce our special guest, Paul Schmitz.
Awesome, thanks so much, and thanks for your patience. Sorry for that unintended commercial interruption. I'm happy to bring aboard someone that I've known a long time. In fact, you know him just as a book author, but I would say he's been an incredible champion for my own professional development and the work. And so I'm excited to bring on the CEO of Public Allies. I don't need to do the introduction because we'll do some origin story. He's got some great origin story. He's got some great stuff. But I'm really excited to bring on Paul Schmitz. Paul, greetings from Milwaukee, which you're also in. Greetings.
Yep. Hi, everybody.
Paul says, for those at home, this is the gentleman's cave that Paul's in. It's a secret bunker. Anytime there's any disturbance in the funding force of AmeriCorps, he has to hide there just to make sure he's okay. So all levity aside, Paul, thanks for joining us today, and because we know you've been around this great big old country, we're talking about this book, and so now we've conquered space, the internet, the vast frontier, for us to talk about Everyone Leads. And so let's start off, Paul. Give us some of that origin story a little bit before we ask you the big question, what do you mean by Everyone Leads? I want you to tell you, and here's the thing, here's my challenge, Paul. You've done this stand-up bit so many times. It's kind of like when rock stars got to play the same songs over and over. So I want to challenge you to tell your origin story in a way that there's an extra verse we didn't get before, or you're noodling on a riff that you don't know. Let's try this chord. I don't want to hear you do the hashed bit. I want to hear something new about your origin story. Much like, I'm sure, Jeff Tweedy discovers when he plays heavy metal drummer for the umpteenth time when they're on tour. Go ahead. What you got, Paul?
Thanks, Mac. Hi, everybody. Well, just to give a little background on how I came to my leadership and also my view of leadership is that I was someone who growing up struggled a lot, and so I was institutionalized when I was 16 for drug addiction. I suffered from depression. I had been, homeless when I was 18, and I was someone who, let's just say, was not on a path of leadership, and was certainly not someone who saw myself as someone who would make a difference, let alone someone who others saw as making a difference. And I was fortunate in that the services I received and the support groups I was part of connected me with mentors and friends who played a big role in supporting my recovery on these issues. And I was fortunate at the time that I was able later in life to go back to college. And the quick thing I'll say about this, because I heard Elizabeth Warren talk about this last week on the Daily Show, is when I applied in June to start college in September, and my first and I didn't have a GPA or test or anything like that. I just paid $50 and applied. I started 3 months later, and my first semester tuition was, I think, $975, which could be paid in installments. And it saddens me today that for those of us who are late bloomers or second chancers, there's no way that could happen today. You couldn't apply to start in September. You couldn't pay less than $1,000 tuition a semester. It really was a time that if you were someone who was trying to work your way back in, there were opportunities. In any event, I did well in college, and I worked as a gardener in the summers. I worked at a telemarketer for an insurance agency. And so, I mean, I wasn't someone who, again, was deeply involved in public service, but I wanted to make a difference. And a big part of it for me was that because so many people had helped me, I felt I had a responsibility to help others, to pay forward the support that I'd received. And I had a chance to attend a conference in Wisconsin. This was in December of 1992. And it was a small conference that this foundation was hosting, and I applied for a scholarship to go to it at my college. And I ended up sitting down the first night at dinner, and next to me was this woman who talked to me about that she was starting a nonprofit called Public Allies. And that's literally how it happened. And I heard what she was doing, and I asked, how could I participate? And she said, why don't you start one in your community? And so with all the skills I've gained as a drug dealer, telemarketer, and gardener, I thought I could be an executive director of a nonprofit. And at the age of, I guess I was 24, 25 at the time, I still hadn't finished my degree yet, I started Public Allies Milwaukee. And so, to call it accidental is generous. It really wasn't the plan. But when I heard this idea of bringing diverse people together that all kinds of people could lead, and if you brought all these diverse people together to work together and build a community, you could really create change. And this idea that there's all these young people who want to make a difference but don't know how, especially those who've experienced issues, that just resonated with me in such a powerful way, and I devoted my life to it. And I'm trying to think of the Mac riff on this. I think I added a few new notes in there.
I love it. Love
it. Actually, this actually is usually part of my presentation, but I'll bring it because people never believe this. So let's see if we can get this in there. That's me.
Mullet.
Yes.
Nice. Look at that.
That's me at age 19.
Paul, there's One Direction, and that says none direction. That's none direction. That's not One Direction. That's none direction. That guy.
That was at the time that the Grateful Dead was suing me, which happened. So I always thought that was kind of badass that the Grateful Dead sued me, but anyway. So that's how I came into it, and so I share that only to say that that's why I'm so inspired by the people we work with, because what I'm doing now is inconceivable to me in that picture.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've seen and had the chance to participate in over the last 20 years is see people achieve things they couldn't dream of achieving. And it's seeing that power within people once it gets released that gives me so much faith and makes me believe so much in this idea. And that's where the passion all comes from my own life experience. And the journey from then to now has had a lot of ups and downs, and I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've learned a lot of hard lessons.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a straight line. But the reality is I got here, and it was through the support and work with a lot of people and through these values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Paul, I just want to remark, the thing that strikes me is that how many times are we at a conference or something? And like you said, you were at a special one. Wingspread was a pretty nice conference, right, at the time.
But it's only 45 people.
Right, but the thing is, how many times does somebody sit next to you and go like, hey, this is what I do, and that turns into, like you said, like the path that you came on. I mean, how many times am I just phoning it in at the top of a conference and just like, I'm just getting my folder together, I'm just getting I'm looking at my phone, forget this, right? It's really amazing. Everyone leads. It also reminds me, like, any moment, something might be happening, right, that could become, you becoming the spokesperson for bow ties and maybe rock. And I'm probably facetious, but I think it speaks to like how opportunity and capitalizing on opportunity is also interwoven in this, right? Like you said, it wasn't a straight line, but it wasn't like anything's either handed to you as well. There's a lot of being agile and being ready for service.
Jim Collins, who wrote the Good to Great and Built to Last and all those great business books, in his newest book he talks about return on luck. And that one of the things he finds among successful leaders is that they have good return on luck. And what he found is that every leader had luck, bad luck and good luck. You get both. But certain people got greater returns on their bad or good luck than others. And I think that's the thing, is when you have those opportunities, it's how you, as you say, how you capitalize and build on them that really matters. Let's take some other questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Paul, that was one of my favorite parts of the book when you talk about your story and kind of your unconventional, let's say, path to leadership. And we've been throwing this phrase around a lot, and it's the title of the book. But can you talk a little bit about what you mean when you say everyone leads? What does that look like?
So to me, what it means is that it doesn't mean everyone should be in charge of everything at the same time. The way I look at it is leadership is a muscle, and that everyone has that muscle. And that first time in your life you step up on a cause, on an issue on behalf of yourself or somebody you care about, that's when you start building that muscle. And like any other muscle, it only gets stronger with exercise and practice. And so the more that you use the muscle, the more it builds. You know, Dr. King, when he was in college, when he was in graduate school, he did his first preaching in Brooklyn. The evaluation said he didn't relate well to common people. It's not like he was born with the I have a dream muscle. That built over time and through struggle and through challenge. And so often we see leaders when they've reached the top, and we don't see the journey that took them there and all the struggle and development lessons, but they all had to build their muscles too. And so the belief is that everyone has the muscle, and just we have to build the collective muscle of our organizations and our communities if we're going to solve problems. And you know, the Army has this notion that every soldier has to both be a leader and follower, and I'd say that's true because it does, you know, being a lead, everyone leads doesn't mean I'm always the leader. Sometimes I'm the follower. And it's situational when you step up and when you step back. But the point is that you have the ability to step up. And just finally, the definition we use of leadership is based on 3 ideas. First is that leadership is an action everyone can do, not a position few people can hold. When you have that notion of the verb, the lead, it really opens up who can do it instead of the noun, which really restricts it. The second is the core work of leadership. What do leaders do? Leaders take responsibility. Leaders step up and say, I'm going to get something done. They don't stop and say, blame somebody else or look for someone else to do it. Leaders step up and say, I'm going to get this done. I'm willing to do what it takes, learn what I have to learn, work with whoever I worked with, but I'm going to own this result. So the second part of the definition is really about stepping up and taking responsibility. And the third part of our definition is based on what I would call the secret sauce of leadership, with it, which is values. And you know, the who you are as a leader, understanding your values, your mission, and always being true to that is important. And I think the challenge a lot of the times is that we start to think that the ends justify the means. But when you also think of the worst boss you've had or a public leader you don't admire, it's usually not that they're not smart enough or have the skills to do the job, it's that their values are a mess. Anthony Weiner probably was smart enough to be mayor of New York, but his values, who he was a complete mess, right? So I think when we think about leadership, we have to think about, you know, that it's an action, that it's about stepping up and taking responsibility, and finally that how we lead, the values we practice define whether it's good leadership or not.
Yeah. Yeah, and something else you talk about in the book related to those is this idea that we are all half full and we're all half empty. And when I read that, I was like, that's so simple, but that's so profound. And, you know, we all have assets and we all have weaknesses. And it's through sort of mixing and matching and combining our assets, you know, that we're able to accomplish things. And for me, it was just like, phew, you know, like, oh, I don't have to be good at everything. You know, like I can with a team, you know, that complements my assets and helps lift me, you know, like is good at things where I'm not. And it's just made me more compassionate towards myself and open towards, you know, other kinds of strengths and assets that are out there. And it's just been kind of a game changer in terms of how I think about, you know, my work these days. And so, Mac, I'm kind of curious, you know, you encountered these ideas as a public ally, you know, long before the book was written. And I'm sort of curious to hear what your experience was like, you know, when you were first introduced to some of these ideas. Like, what did you think the first time you heard everyone leads?
You know, I think when I think back, the first time I heard it was actually even before Public Allies. I got to be in this leadership certificate program at a college at my school, my alma mater, and I remember Paul Arnson, who was a contemporary of Paul's in the asset-based community development faculty, right, around assets. He would say leadership is this action, and I just remember as a student hearing it after being inundated with like the great person theory of leadership, kind of going like, whoa, like it's not the title, you know, and it's really, and the way that it was illustrated to us back then was seeing community block clubs, you know, organize themselves to make to get a better result than sometimes the police would provide around safety. You know, and it wasn't like somebody was the leader of that block club. Like everybody pitched in and added their thing. And I saw that play out when I was in Public Allies, you know, even more when I was an ally myself. And then sort of seeing when we were on team projects, you know, when you have 10 allies in a room and then you invite them to get to know the community and then listen to the community and understand what the strengths are there and try to really understand, you know, our role isn't to do something for the community, but rather understand what's going to accelerate and make the, you know, be better after we leave. You know, that's a shift, you know, and to me that's definitely rooted in this everyone leads concept. It's like you're not coming in to save these people, you're here to listen, to hear the story in a way that they haven't heard it, and how can they see it, you know, with you. And so, I mean, you know, being a young person at that time and hearing it, it was validating and thrilling and exhilarating. And at the same time, it was also scary because it wasn't like there was a lot of examples that we could see, you know, at least when I was in the field at that time, that was always sort of championed, you know, in some way. So I think it was one of those things that it felt young, you know, it felt like, oh, this is how it could be. But also at the same, you know, over the past 17 years now, as I've advanced in my career, it's really been exciting to see it become more and wider adopted, you know, and to that end, I just sort of think our work has become more flatter and less hierarchical, and you know, at least in the not-for-profit sector, right, in terms of how do we solve problems and how do we do things. I think I've really started to see everyone leads, you know, become more of a reality in some ways, right, and it's hard not to look at big movements, you know, like the Arab Spring, right, or all these things that when, you know, when technology is allowing us to communicate better and move faster, it's amazing to see how young and new thinking is allowed to disrupt the way things are. And so when I think of everyone leads, like these are the things that come up for me, and I feel very lucky to have been introduced to it at such where it was, but yet at the same time have the ability to practice it in the different spaces I've been in.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, what are some of the reactions that you've gotten as you have been talking about the book and conducting trainings? I know you were just in Oklahoma City a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things has been just talking to lots of different audiences about these ideas, and I think that what I love most is when people feel validated by it, when they start to think differently about themselves, and more importantly, when they start to think differently about the people they serve. And you know, service is so often about people who see themselves as full and see the people they serve as empty and believe their job is to fill them up, which we think at best is arrogant and at worst is oppressive. And so from our perspective, you know, going back to that idea, if we recognize that all of us on this broadcast today, we all have our fullness, we all have the things that make us great friends, family members, workers, leaders, the things that make us great at what we do. But all of us also have our own emptiness. Every single one of us has things we're ashamed of, mistakes we've made, relationships that have gone wrong, conflicts we have. And if we can always remember to never define anyone by their emptiness and only define people by their fullness. And that doesn't mean we excuse the emptiness, it doesn't mean we deny it's there, but we recognize that if we define someone solely by our last conflict with them or their emptiness, then we should expect that people will define us that way too, and none of us wants to be defined that way. And too often when people are getting service, we're only defining them by their emptiness, and the people serving are only seen for their fullness. And I think, again, we think that's arrogant or oppressive, and we think it's a much healthier way, and it changes the power dynamic, and it opens up the way you can build relationships with people when you have confidence in your fullness and humility about your own emptiness. And I think for working with others it helps, because I can guarantee you that Mac said these very nice things about me, but if you wanted, if you gave him a couple beers and asked him to describe some of my emptiness, I'm sure he could do it pretty quickly. But we work together.
You wouldn't need beer. You wouldn't need the beer. We could do it right now.
You wouldn't need beer. So, but we work together because of our fullness, and we don't, you know, even if I screw up, you can't define me that way. And if you screw up, I can't define you that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it means we have to work through the conflict or the issue. But it means that we have to always have that humility in our leadership.
Yeah, and that asset-based approach is is something that
This is
I'm beginning to see more, people talking about more. And that's part of the reason why, we selected this book, and encouraged, YNPN members and anyone who was around, basically, anyone who would listen to us to read it. But, something else that...
Public Allies thanks you because all the proceeds from the book go to Public Allies. So on behalf of Public Allies, thank you everyone who bought it.
We're also casting for the movie, so I don't know if we can get Gosling. I don't think we can get Gosling right now. So, and I think Ralph Fiennes, my man, he's got a certain set of skills, but I still don't think he can rock the boat side.
To gain to do, but anyways.
I was going to say something else that you said in the book that really resonated with me, and I think with a couple of other people that we've talked to, is diversity isn't just something you believe in. It's something you act to bring about, and your results matter. And everyone that we've talked to about the book, that's been something that an idea that really stood out for them. And one of the things that we often hear from our chapter leaders is that they are really eager, to make their YNPN chapters or their workplaces or their community groups more diverse and inclusive, but they're not sure how to start. They're not sure what that first step is. And in a lot of cases, I think it's that many of our leaders are sensitive to the fact that they come to these issues with a certain amount of privilege. This is actually something that you talk a little bit about in the book, as something that you've confronted. So, I'd love to hear from you about, how would you advise that folks start putting, diversity and inclusion, taking it from idea to practice? And particularly for those of us, with privilege, how do we elevate those around us, in a way that's not taking up space that they could be stepping into?
That's a great question and great point. And it was a public guy named Susan Edwards who was doing our allies at the end of their term of service had to do what's called a presentation of learning, where they for 15 minutes present what they learned from the program before all their peers and local community leaders, and they have to describe how they're practicing these 5 values. And then they get questions from the audience for 15 or 20 minutes. And her supervisor asked her, what does my generation of activists, he was a baby boomer leader, need to learn that you got from Public Allies? And she said, you look at diversity as an ideal, something to believe in. We learned it's an action, it's something you do. What she said next was, she said, you walk into a room that's not diverse and you feel bad about it. We walk into a room that's not diverse and we own it. And I think that's the difference. It's the notion that I am responsible for, if I'm committed to inclusion, then I am responsible for changing the room. And so I think that as you say, one is, it's absolutely important to be aware of privilege, discuss privilege, and to be open about how privilege distorts your view. I think the second thing is that when you change who's sitting at your table, you have to be willing to change the table itself. You can't just say, I want a little bit of diversity, but I don't want to change how we look at things or what we do, because by its nature, if you're inclusive, the conversations are going to change, the work's going to change. And I think that when one commits to this, you have to ask yourself in an honest way, who's not at our table? And then you have to proactively go out, and you have to build the relationships that make it possible to bring new people to the table, and you have to hold yourself accountable for the result. The big reality with diversity is that lots of people believe that they can get away with it by caring about the inputs, their efforts. But efforts don't matter unless the results are there. If your leadership team is all white and you're serving communities of color, you've got a problem, and you have to decide and own it at the level that says, I'm going to fix this. It's wrong. And so I think that that's key. We've had a lot of stories about this week, and I got into a debate on Facebook this week because I get pissed off about how easy it is, I feel, for a lot of people in the social enterprise, social entrepreneurship movement to care about supporting people of color around the world and to talk about Africa and all these things, but not have diversity within their companies or organizations in the United States. I get disturbed by the amount of privileged white people who create organizations, and again, they feel bad they're not diverse, but they don't own it. And that, to me, is the push. You got to own it. You got to be willing to change it. You've got to be willing to make sacrifices in order to do that. But I will tell you that the reason why Public Allies has been so successful is because we have different perspectives. If it was mostly people who thought like me or looked like me, you know, we'd be a disaster. And it's because we made a commitment that at every level we've got to make sure we're bringing different people to the conversation. If we're going to plan an initiative, we've got to make sure there are people who are different at that table too. And so that's why, as I said, I think we have to be really, we have to focus on the actions we take, not on our beliefs.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if I could chime in real quick, Jamie, you know, like we're actually experiencing in this real, you know, in real time that you're talking about. Like we are, again, I don't know, I'll just go ahead and share it. Like we're actually searching for staff, right? Like we're hiring at Public Allies, right? And one thing we're being very sensitive about is where are we advertising this stuff? Because if we go to the same channels, like let's post it at Idealist or let's post it here, right? Like you're going to tend to get the same folks who go to those places. And so that's something like Paul just described, like we had to check ourselves on as we did our own search. Like where is our pipelines to people working at Public Allies? And I think that's, you know, when Paul talks about it, I think he's exactly describing some of our own, and what we discovered in this process as we're in the middle of this search is that, you know, we can't be satisfied with the first wave of, okay, we post it off, we send it to people. We just have to keep being relentless and going like, where is the talent at? And who do we know? And I think like when we start getting uncomfortable is really like a good starting point for us, because that's when we know like, okay, we're starting to get to the point where we don't know, and that's good because we got to put light on what we don't know as much as possible. So I definitely want to echo what Paul's saying. That you know, one of the thoughts we're thinking is like, well, how do we move beyond the esoteric? Like, this is something we deal with here at our own like how we're staffing up, you know, Public Allies right now, and I'm really excited to hear that, even though I think we're a bit frustrated because we want to get talent as soon as possible, if that makes sense, right? Because there's a lot of work to do. I think we're also being very intentional. Like we just don't want people that are carbon copies of ourselves. We want people that are passionate about the values, but we also want to be challenged in how we look at the world, you know, because we think that'll ultimately make us better, right? And so I look forward to hopefully us following through and doing it. But it's interesting how we're going through that right now in our program team as well. So I wanted to share like that. This is real. We're dealing with this right now. So.
And I think that's an important point. I put this out at the beginning of the book that we don't declare perfection in any of this, and I don't declare perfection. It is a struggle, and you have to keep pushing at it and keep trying. But if you decide we need to make sure we have perspectives we don't have at the table, at our table, then you have to be willing to struggle further until you get those perspectives. And that's what I think Mac's alluding to, is we started looking and saying, okay, what perspectives don't we have at the table? And then, you know, we've got to keep searching until we find people who bring those perspectives, because we need different points of view, because that's what's going to make us better and stronger. And I think that's what always has made us better and stronger.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You know, one example that kind of leaps to mind is, you know, technology conferences have been criticized for not having women, you know, speaking at the conference, or, you know, people of color. And, you know, they've kind of thrown up their hands and said, well, but they don't apply, you know. And, you know, similarly, we've heard, you know, the statistic that women have to be asked 5 or 6 times to run for office. You know, sometimes, like, being diverse and being inclusive means going to the communities where those people are and reaching out to them and letting them know that they're welcome and you're interested in hearing their perspective. You know, not simply just kind of posting an announcement in the usual places and, you know, hoping that they'll come to you. But that is something you have to be really active and thoughtful about. And that's, like, Mac, thanks for sharing, like, Public Allies experience. You know, I think a lot of our, you know, chapter leaders, you know, we talk about it as an organization. But I think everyone sort of feels like, well, we're the only ones who aren't doing this, or we're the only ones who don't know how to do it. And that's not true. You know, everyone is figuring it out as they go and learning, and so it's awesome to hear a real life example of how your organization is approaching this. So let's maybe head to some questions from the Twitter chat that we had a few weeks ago. So a few weeks ago, we got together, and some of the folks who had read the book had a Twitter chat. And so, Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the topics that came up during that chat. One of the things that came up was one of our members shared that, even though she used to work for an organization that, had a pretty deep hierarchy, she still felt like she had leadership opportunities. And I think that started an interesting discussion that we didn't quite get to finish, which is, I'm curious to hear about, in your opinion, like, how does organizational structure relate to this idea that everyone leads? Can you still have a hierarchy and still have distributed leadership and collaboration? What's the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, so I think the big question is sometimes people are waiting for people to hand them leadership rather than taking leadership. And I think that if you step up and assume often more responsibility than you've been given and accomplish more than you were expected, that's how you start to step up from wherever you are. And one of the things I always say to young people, and I know this is very true in my own case, I've been successful not because of what I know, but because of how resourceful I've been able to be in engaging the people that I know. And I think that the key is, I always say that I'm less interested in how much you know than in how many relationships you have and how good you are
Paul, we're having
for opportunity and innovation and collaboration and the rest. And when
So, Paul, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. You're breaking up a little bit, and I just want to make sure we're not missing any of your insights. Are you back with us? Well, Mac, while we get Paul,
yeah. Well, as Paul was riffing a little bit, it sort of lent me to mind that, like, I can definitely echo that. I remember what it's like, being frontline. I know it's like being, kind of ascending, and I'm still ascending in a lot of ways, right? If we're playing that game, and I think it's true that there are limits to sort of positional power, right? Or decision points that one gets to hold the wheel and make the call on. Right, and so that I think it's true that there's limits to that because that's hierarchy, right? How we can get things done. But to, what really resonated with what Paul said is there is no limit to the amount of ways you understand the people you're with, being your teammates. There's no limit to being a better understanding of the people that you're trying to work with and making their lives better. There's no limit in trying to understand how things of fields that are totally different from yours could be totally relevant to what you're about. And I think that it's about that being that relentlessness, that's what I hear about taking leadership, right? Because the great moments are rarely, the great moments when people are being quote-unquote leaders are rarely like in video games where it's like choose your own adventure or something like pick A, B, and C, right? It's happening in real time. So, I think when I think of like what it means to step up and take leadership, I think that only happens when you really understand.
Hello?
I think we just lost Mac, but now Paul. Yeah, welcome back, Paul. We can hear you now.
Okay.
But yeah, so Mac was just kind of building on what you had said, and your answer to the question. So you broke up a little bit, but I'd love to hear kind of your concluding thoughts on, how young nonprofit professionals basically can start to introduce these ideas into their organizations.
Again, I think the biggest thing is taking responsibility and demonstrating you can. It means when you make mistakes, admitting it. It means if you take responsibility and you fail, admitting the failure, acknowledging what you've learned, and acknowledging how you'll do it differently next time, which I find a big problem with a lot of young leaders is they don't want to admit failure or mistakes, but when you don't, you eliminate the chance that people can give you feedback and talk to you about it. I think that it's important to as I said, take greater responsibility than you're given and demonstrate that you can do it. And that to me, I mean, I never waited, for. I think part of it was being more of an entrepreneur. I never waited for people to say, "Hey, Paul, will you take this on?" I just did it. And I guess that's always been my view, is that wherever you are, there's ways you can step up, and there's ways you can demonstrate and take greater responsibility. And if you do that, then you'll earn more and more opportunity. Now, again, sometimes you just have a crappy boss, and that's a problem. But overall, I think it's about taking responsibility. And then if you take that responsibility and you fail or make mistakes, admit it right away, acknowledge the learning, and talk about how you'll do it differently. And that's how you get more opportunities.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, it's interesting that you say that, because in the book you talk about a woman named Malia, I believe is her name, and you share that she was one of those super achievers who, thought that her way of collaborating was doing all of the tasks for the group, right? Like, she'd be in the team and she'd be like, oh, I can do this so much better than everyone else, and everyone will just be grateful that I took it on. And like, yeah. I related to that so hard. Like that was me, like in school, I was like, I'm gonna spend 4 hours making this awesome diorama about the French Revolution. Everyone's gonna be so happy that I did it. And this book has really kind of opened up my eyes to like, yeah, no, people probably weren't actually grateful for that. And in some ways, as you were talking about, that when you make mistakes, it's important to like acknowledge those mistakes and to reach out and to build that trust. And so I'm just wondering, a lot of the things that you talk about in this book, this collaborative leadership, this distributed leadership, it requires a lot of trust. And so what would you just say to like, young Jamie who's like staying up to build that diorama? Like, how would you help her understand and build that trust with those around her and kind of understand how to collaborate?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest thing is to recognize that it is a group effort, and that sometimes I think people get carried away with their own vision and haven't recognized whether everyone else shares that vision and is bought into it. And so I think you have to be careful. And I think one of the things I catch myself doing is I'll go through a process of having dozens of conversations over time about an idea. And by the time I'm telling somebody else, I've already been thinking about it for like 6 weeks and had 20 conversations. And I'm expecting them to get where I got over 6 weeks in the next 5 minutes. And so I think we have to create space to, I'm sure Mac's seen me do that. We have to create space to kind of bring people, to meet people where they are, and not always expect people to come to where we are. And others may have not wanted to do the diorama, Jamie. I'm sorry, but and maybe they all were, but it would be much better if you knew that they were all like, yeah, Jamie, thank you, on the front end versus on the back end being like, oh man. And I think that, again, I think that point about stepping up and taking responsibility is that, it's about kind of responsibility for common goals, and so the goal has to be bigger than us. It shouldn't be just about us, but if it's bigger than us, then others have to own that goal too. And I think that's the job of the leaders, to enlist other people in wanting to pursue that with us. And that's why we need to build the credibility with people, and as you say, the trust. Leadership's is inherently a collaborative act because you do it with others, and collaboration is inherently about trust building. As I was saying, I was talking to some staff this morning about the fact that I think that the goal of collaboration is to have conflict in the room, because good collaboration inherently has conflict, because Mac and I know Mac, but Mac and I aren't necessarily going to see things the same way. But the question is whether we can have that difference together in a meeting, or whether we don't have that difference in the meeting, which means each of us goes outside the meeting and bitches about how the other one doesn't get it. And if you're people think good collaboration means no conflict. It's the opposite of that. It means lots of conflict. But the difference is you trust each other enough that you can have constructive conflict, which means things build from that, and that tension creates new ideas and better solutions. Versus destructive conflict, when you leave the room and bitch about the person, and it just makes everyone resent each other worse and not get anything done. So I think that that's why trust building and collaboration is so important. Someone like Mac, who's a real master at community building, it's like, how do you create environments where people can have constructive conflict and constructive difference is really, and as I said, I think the best partners, Mac knows, I run Public Eyes in partnership with Chris, our CEO. We don't agree a lot of the time, and we can call each other out on it. But we have total trust and in fact, love for each other, that we can have those differences in the room. And I think that's the key thing. If you can do that, then you've got great trust.
Another thing about it, I hope this is working. Hope y'all can hear me okay. Great, right on. I think another thing helps. I've been in the room with Paul and other teammates when we're getting into it, and I think what Paul's also really graceful at is like not taking himself so seriously, because Paul knows I'll snark up a room. And I partly do it as just sort of an exhaust mechanism, right? Like, because like if you're not playful and light about it sometimes, right? That actually invites ways to be in conflict with somebody is seeing it with a sense of humor, right? Because if we're not attached to what we're talking about so much, then we can actually introduce stuff that might even be threatening to us, but at least we get to be in the room with it. And so I definitely want to like yes and what Paul's talking about. I think a big part of it is Paul's got a great sense of humor. Lord knows if he's been able to work with me for several years, knowing that. Oftentimes, we'll either we often make each other the object of derision in it, and I think that's part of the culture, at least where we're working, is like, how do you fight, but how do you fight fair, but how do you, at the end of the day, we gotta do this together, and so I think that's another key part of. I love that notion of collaboration. It is conflict, but I think also part of it is, we know what to attack, and usually it's not each other. We're attacking the ideas, or we're attacking the things, and so that way we can, we don't have this ego we're holding on to this idea because it's attached to us, but rather how do we get the result that's going to be best for what we're trying to do. So.
Yeah. Well, and when I think back to my diorama example, I love this idea of like healthy conflict, right? Because it's like probably a lot of it was that I was afraid to have to like talk about how we were going to do this thing. So I was like, it's just easier for me to do it. I'll just do it. And that's not healthy, and it's cutting off viewpoints, and it probably wasn't the best diorama we could have made. But so we're coming up on the top of the hour, and so I want to thank you guys so much for letting me chat with you tonight and for sharing your insights with our members. Paul, the CEO of Public Allies and the author of Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up, and Mac Antigua, the Director of Alumni Engagement for Public Allies. So thank you guys for joining us tonight, and thank you to everyone watching for joining and for bearing with us throughout our technical difficulties. I hope you enjoyed.
My pleasure. If people have additional questions or feedback, if people have seen, I'll respond over Twitter, so feel free to share that feedback or share those questions. It's helpful to me. And again, thank you, everybody, and wishing you all the best in your own leadership journeys, and keep stepping up.
Yeah, absolutely. Mac, would you like to?
Yeah, you can also. Yeah, find me on Twitter at MacArthur31. Feel free to hit me there if you got any questions. And thanks again for allowing me and Paul to be part of history, which is the first Google Hang. There's going to be a trivia question someday. Who was the first? So
that's right. You're
excited to be part of a trivia question.
Well, thank you guys so much. And everyone have a great evening. And be sure to pick up Everyone Leads, Buying Leadership from the Community Up. Fantastic book. Good night, guys.
Look, Channing Tatum. It's Channing Tatum. We're going to have Channing Tatum. That's Paul. Channing Tatum.